Have you ever felt a bitterness and thirst for revenge so deep you thought you could never forgive? This is the story of a young shepherd named Arthur who lost the only thing he loved and whose heart was filled with hatred and vengeance. And when he finally had the culprit in front of him, he discovered that true power isn't found in hatred, but in forgiveness. If you believe forgiveness can change lives, subscribe to the channel. They say that in the rolling plains at the foot of rugged hills, where the wind blew with an ancient whisper and the dawn painted the sky in shades of gold, lived a young shepherd named Arthur. Life had not been generous to him. He was an orphan, and the only things he inherited from his father were a small stone cabin, a worn wooden staff, and a single sheep as white as snow. That sheep was his only treasure and his inseparable companion. He named her Star, for a black patch on her forehead that shone under the sun as if it were a star fallen from the sky. To Arthur, Star was not just an animal. She was his family, his comfort, and his reason to smile. In the vast grasslands, where the green stretched until it was lost on the horizon, the two shared a simple and pure existence. He spoke to her as one would talk to an old friend, and she would answer with a soft bleat, as if she understood every word. On cold nights, when the moon was reflected on the rocky peaks, Arthur slept beside Star, feeling in her warm wool the comfort that life had denied him. In her, the humble shepherd found a peace the world could not give him. Every dawn, he would set out, staff in hand, and guide Star through the paths of the hills. While she grazed on the fresh grass, he would sit under a lonely old olive tree, take out his reed flute, and let a melancholy melody rise into the air. Sometimes Star would lift her head and watch him with her gentle eyes, as if she understood that those notes were not just music, but the thoughts of a heart that, though lonely, still knew how to dream. But the peace that enveloped Arthur's life would not last forever. In the highlands and rocky outcrops, an ancient danger was hiding, a silent predator that the shepherds of the valley spoke of with fear. They talked of a great lion, powerful and almost invisible among the rocks, that would descend at dusk to take sheep without a trace. Arthur listened to these stories by the warmth of the fire and felt a knot tighten in his chest. From then on, he never took his eyes off Star for a single moment, guarding her with the devotion of one who protects the only thing he loves in the world. One afternoon, after leading Star to graze in the hills, Arthur began the journey back to his cabin. The sun was starting to set behind the peaks when the sky was suddenly covered with dark, heavy clouds. The wind blew with a strange force, bending the trees and kicking up dust from the path. In a matter of minutes, a torrential rain fell upon the valley, turning the earth into a deep and treacherous mudslide. Arthur gripped his staff tightly as he guided Star along the narrow path that descended toward the river. Every step became more difficult. The mud clung to his sandals, water rushed down from the hillsides, and the cold chilled him to the bone. Still he pressed on, determined to get home before nightfall. Suddenly, his foot got stuck in a thick pit of mud. He struggled to free himself, planting his staff into the ground for leverage. It was then that he felt it, an abrupt, unnatural silence, broken only by the pounding of the rain. He looked up, and among the rocks he saw a tawny shadow move with the speed of a lightning strike. Before he could shout or raise his staff, the lion leapt. There was no roar, no warning, only a precise leap and a lethal bite to her neck. In a second, Star fell. Arthur tried to run to her but slipped in the mud and fell to his knees. He managed to see the animal's golden eyes looking at him, cold and unfathomable, before it disappeared into the shadows, dragging the lifeless body of her friend with it. When the rain finally stopped, only Arthur, the mud, and a silence that weighed like a tombstone over the valley remained. With a broken soul, he dragged himself to the spot where he had seen Star fall, but all that was left was a puddle of water mixed with her blood. In that instant, the sadness transformed into a fire inside his chest. He was no longer the quiet young man from before, but a man scarred by loss, with a single purpose in his heart: to avenge her. He returned to the village with his face hardened by pain, and his eyes empty, as if his soul had been washed away with the rain. No one dared to speak to him. One look was enough to understand what had happened. Mothers pulled their children away. The men bowed their heads in silence. Among them, an old man with a kind gaze approached. He was known to all as Old Man Elias, a wise man who had been a shepherd for more years than Arthur had been alive. He leaned on his staff, looked at him with compassion, and said in a low voice, "Son, fate sometimes takes what we love most. The lion takes, but God gives back in ways we don't always understand. Don't let hatred guide you, because hatred only breeds more darkness." Arthur looked down, but his hands were trembling. The old man's voice was wise, yes, but his heart was burning. "I know, Elias," he answered with a broken voice. "I know God sees everything, and blessed be His will. But I can't just wait. I cannot accept that beast remaining alive while my sheep's blood lies in the mud." The old man sighed sadly, seeing how fury was taking hold of the young man. He knew there were no words capable of extinguishing a fire born from both love and pain. Arthur turned and walked toward his cabin, with the storm now raging inside him. That night, he lit a lamp that cast a flickering light and pulled an old sword from under his bed that had belonged to his father. The blade showed the passage of years, but the hilt still fit his hand as if it was made for him. He spent the entire night sharpening the blade on a whetstone. The rasp of metal against stone sounded dry and sharp, like the grinding of teeth that heralds a dark thought. As he prepared his leather pouch, he put the sword on his belt, wrapped a portion of hard bread, and added a piece of resin to start a fire where needed. Every object he packed was a small promise: food for the journey, fire to keep from freezing, and the sword to settle the score. As he adjusted the strap, the image of Star returned again and again to his mind: the white of her wool, the star-shaped patch, and his grief transformed into a cold determination. He didn't think about turning back. His heart was set in one direction. At the first ray of dawn, he put on his worn clothes, gripped the hilt with hands that no longer trembled so much, and went out. He didn't look at the cabin. He didn't look at the village. He only looked toward the hills, where vengeance awaited him like a shadow he would finally go to face. He returned to the valley and followed the lion's tracks marked in the wet mud. The trail led him beyond the known pastures, up to the steep crags where no shepherd dared to venture. Arthur advanced with his heart lit by rage, and every time exhaustion threatened to stop him, he remembered Star's noble eyes. Then the pain transformed into strength, and the fire of vengeance burned again in his chest with a fierce glow. Arthur walked for 2 whole days, crossing rugged hills and paths so narrow he could barely keep his footing. The sun and the wind beat down on him without mercy, but his determination was stronger than his fatigue. As the evening of the second day fell, he reached a desolate area where the silence weighed like a curse. In front of him stood several dark caves, open like the maws of sleeping monsters. The lion's tracks led directly to the largest one. Arthur stopped at the entrance. The gloom seemed to watch him. He took a deep breath, unsheathed his sword, made a small torch with the resin, and took a step inside. He didn't know it yet, but what awaited him in that darkness was not just his enemy, but the hardest lesson of his life. Arthur entered the dark cave, his sword gleaming faintly. All his senses were on high alert, and his heart pounded in his chest, prepared to face the beast that had taken everything from him. A dense smell of damp earth and fur filled the air. He advanced slowly, guided by the flame of his torch, which cast dancing shadows on the uneven walls. Then he heard it, a faint, fragile whimper. It was not a roar or a growl from the shadows, but something different, a sound like the crying of children.
Curiosity, mixed with fear, led him to approach cautiously toward that broken voice in the darkness. He reached a small chamber in the heart of the cave, and what he saw there froze his blood, not from fear, but from shock. In a corner, huddled and trembling, were two lion cubs, small balls of spotted fur with their eyes barely open, their whimpers tearing at his soul. They were weak, hungry, and each one sought the warmth of the other. For a moment, Arthur's rage roared inside him. If the mother isn't here, then this is my chance. I will avenge Star by ending what that beast loves most. But the sight of those helpless creatures sent a different kind of jolt through his heart. He didn't attack. He stood motionless, the sword trembling in his hands as something inside him began to waver between rage and an unexpected compassion. Friend, where in the world are you joining us from today? Tell me in the comments and let me know, do you believe that forgiveness truly sets you free? I would love to know what you think. Your opinion could be the spark that enlightens someone else. Let's continue. Arthur remained motionless, the sword still raised as his gaze drifted toward the small, huddled cubs. He thought of her mother. She must be nearby, watching him, waiting for the moment to attack. Then he heard it. It wasn't a growl or a hidden roar from the shadows, but a low, broken moan coming from another corner of the cave. A sound filled with pain, not fury. Arthur turned slowly toward the darkness, and the flickering light of his torch revealed something that stopped him in his tracks. The motionless silhouette of the lioness, curled up, letting out those laments that sounded more like a plea than a threat. As he approached carefully, Arthur saw the cause of the sound. An old metal trap, corroded by the time, had clamped its jaws on the lioness's hind leg. The skin and fur around the trap were torn and matted with dried blood. The rusted edge dug into her flesh, and her leg was twisted at an impossible angle. A sharp smell of blood and metal filled the air. The lioness tried to get up, and a wave of pain crossed her yellow eyes. She tried to find a way to escape, but could do nothing more than let out another moan, this time almost voiceless, like someone begging for help instead of preparing for a fight. Near her, Arthur saw the remains of Star. The sheep had barely been touched, as if the mother had only taken just enough to produce milk and feed her young. That sight hit his stomach with a new force. The lioness had not attacked his sheep with cruel intent, but out of necessity. She had risked everything to eat and produce milk for her helpless cubs.
Watching the wounded mother, her short breaths, and the suffering that emanated from her body, Arthur's fury faltered. The thing he had come to destroy now appeared to him as a reflection. A wounded mother who also loved and protected her children. The horrible truth was revealed to him with raw clarity. The enemy he sought was not just a monster, but a creature trapped by the same cruel world that had taken everything from him. Arthur sank to the ground, his sword beside him, as the cave breathed in silence. The memories of Star and his burning rage pushed him to act. But looking at the defenseless cubs and hearing the wounded lioness's moans, something in him hesitated. For a moment he thought of plunging the blade and ending it all, but the vision of more innocent creatures brought back his doubt. In that silence he reflected. If he answered pain with more violence, he would only create more orphans and darkness. He whispered a brief plea. God, how am I going to do this? If I strike with this sword now, I will only make more orphans. I will not write another name on this earth that swears blood for blood." The invocation didn't calm his rage, but it opened a crack through which doubt began to filter. He felt the fury give way to compassion and decided that true bravery was to eliminate hatred, to forgive and to help, not to destroy. With slow, deliberate steps, he took the torch, sheathed his sword, and approached the lioness, ready to free her from her trap. He knelt carefully, so as not to scare the animal, and studied the trap clamped on her leg. It was old, solid, and closed like an iron jaw. It was impossible to open it with his hands alone. Arthur then remembered the remains of a pine tree split by lightning he had seen at the cave entrance. He went out without delay, dragged a thick, sturdy branch back inside, and placed it as a lever against the trap, ready to force it with all his weight. It seemed the trap wasn't new. Perhaps she had been caught the day before, and with great effort had dragged it back to the cave seeking refuge. Young Arthur approached the lioness again with slow movements, murmuring soft words. The beast watched him with suspicion, baring her teeth, though her weak body could barely support itself. Arthur placed one end of the branch between the iron jaws of the trap and pressed with all his might. The lioness let out a sharp cry as the metal shifted, but he didn't stop. He kept pushing until a sharp crack broke the silence. The trap finally gave way, and the animal's paw was free, though wounded and bleeding. Without wasting time, Arthur left the cave. He looked for some medicinal leaves he knew from his father were used to heal wounds. He chewed them to soften them, and returned to apply them carefully to the injured paw. Then he retreated slowly to the entrance, sitting down to watch without moving an inch. He didn't raise his sword or threaten the cubs. He just wanted the mother to understand that he had come to help, not to take revenge.
Hours passed, and Arthur remained motionless, sitting in front of the cave, observing the wounded lioness. He went back inside to check on the animal. She was licking her paw carefully, looking up at him from time to time with a mixture of weariness. Then something happened that Arthur would never have imagined. The lioness, weak but determined, dragged herself slowly to her cubs and began to nurse them. Then, with a gesture that chilled him to the bone, she pushed a small piece of meat toward him with her snout. It was from Star, his sheep, whom the lioness had killed. She offered it to Arthur, as if in her own wild language she were thanking him. In that instant, tears began to stream down the young man's cheeks, but they were not tears of anger or sadness. They were tears of understanding. He understood that life and death are in the hands of the eternal, and that they are part of the same cycle, that everything in nature has its purpose, and that revenge only breeds more emptiness and pain. In that moment, young Arthur understood the lesson that fate had wanted to teach him. Compassion is the only language that all creatures understand, and it is the only force capable of breaking the eternal circle of hatred. Arthur did not taste the meat. He stood up without a word, took the last piece of bread he had left from his pouch, and left it at the entrance of the cave. Then, without looking back, he began the journey home, leaving behind the one who had been his enemy and the greatest lesson of his life. The next day, Arthur returned to the village. He was no longer the impulsive young man who had left full of rage, but a different man, with a serene gaze and a soul at peace. He sought out old man Elias and told him everything that had happened.
The old man listened in silence and, with a smile, said, "You lost a sheep, son, but you found your heart, and that is a treasure that few ever find." From then on, Arthur was not just a shepherd. He became the guardian of the plains and hills. He cared for his new flock with diligence, but he also watched over the creatures of the wild. He removed traps, healed injured animals, and guided the lost back to their homes. He never saw the lioness or her cubs up close again, but on quiet evenings, as the sun was setting, he would sometimes see 3 silhouettes in the distance on a rock, watching him in silence, as if they were watching over him and his flock. The villagers used to say that the lions never came near Arthur's sheep, and with time, the young man understood that true courage is not found in taking revenge, but in choosing compassion. Because only when one is able to see oneself reflected in the eyes of their enemy do they understand that the pain and the desire to live are the same in every breathing being. If you've reached the end of this video, give it a like, share it, and subscribe for more stories. And remember, there are more stories on your screen now. Thank you so much. See you in the next one.